Hi, everybody. Today we're going to move in and talk about explanatory methods. So these are the research methods that actually allow you to explain why things are happening. And basically what you have is you have cause and effect. So this is the only method that allows you to establish cause and effect is an explanatory method. And the one method that we have here is experimentation. So experimentation goes beyond correlation. Correlation allows you to predict or determine relationship. Here, if there's a relationship and what kind, positive or negative. Here, you're actually looking to determine what causes specific behaviors. So moving on to cause and effect or explanation. First thing you had to do when you're creating an experiment is create a hypothesis. And here your hypothesis will be worded in terms of cause and effect. So the example I'm going to use as I move through this is I'm going to use the example of a research study that was done on television, watching violent television and aggressive behavior. The hypothesis that the researcher came up with was he believed, or she, sorry, believed that violent television, sorry, causes aggressive play behavior in children. Next thing that the researcher has to do after he or she has created their testable research question, cause and effect relationship being hypothesized, create operational definitions. And with the operational definition, what you're doing is you're basically telling people how you are measuring and exposing subjects to the various things in your experiment. So in the experiment on violent television and aggressive behavior, two things need to be operationally defined. You need to operationally define violent television. So basically what you're doing here is instead of just saying violent television, you're actually going to say violent television in this experiment, and this is what they used, was a 1 hour segment of the movie The Untouchables. And this was a very violent movie. And so they picked a 1 hour segment of that movie and they would expose subjects to it. So subjects would come into the laboratory, watch this hour of the Untouchables. The other group of subjects watched an hour of television, but they watched an hour of a track meet. The reason they selected the track meet was because they wanted it to be about the same level of activity in the second video or television show, but they did not want it to be violent. And so this was an individual track meet with no violence. So operationally defined violent television that way. And then the second thing that needed to be operationally defined was how do you measure aggressive behaviors? And what they did in this particular experiment is they had children, and this experiment was done on children between the ages of 8 and 12, and they had children after they'd watched their television, whether it was the Untouchables or the track meet, they had the children go into a playroom, and that playroom had all kinds of toys in it, and they watched the children behind a one-way mirror and counted the number of quote unquote inappropriate aggressive behaviors that they used. So they had a punching bag in the room. If the child punched the punching bag, that's what the punching bag was for. And so that was not considered an inappropriate aggressive behavior. However, if they would have punched the stuffed animal, the large stuffed animal in the room, that would have been considered inappropriate because that's not what stuffed animals are for. So, same thing with Barbies. If they were playing with a Barbie, that was perfectly appropriate. If they threw the Barbie against the wall, that would be considered an inappropriate aggressive behavior. So those were the operational definitions for this particular experiment. And then the next thing we need to talk about are the variables. And I'm going to have you identify the variables at the end with this particular example. But you have three primary types of variables that are of importance in an experiment. First, you have the independent variable. The independent variable is the thing that the researcher controls and systematically changes for groups of subjects. Or you can go back to your hypothesis, and the independent variables, the thing that you propose, causes a change in some other behavior. So in this experiment, violent, um, the you'd look at the thing that the researcher is controlling or manipulating. And then we have the dependent variable, and the dependent variable is the behavior that we think depends on the level of the independent variable. So this behavior depends on what specific level of the independent variable you're exposed to. Another type of variable that we have is what's called an extraneous or confounding variable. This is basically any variable other than the independent variable that might have an impact on the dependent variable. So if we were looking at an experiment on alcohol consumption and reaction times, and the hypothesis was alcohol consumption causes a decrease in reaction times. The independent variable would be alcohol consumption. I would have different groups that were each consuming different levels of alcohol. The dependent variable would be reaction time. So let's say I used a simulated driving and their objects came out in the road, and I would look at how long did it take the subject to turn away from the variables. So that would be the independent and the dependent in that example. The extraneous or confounding in that example could be a whole host of things. Did the person eat before they came into the experiment? Is the person a big drinker because their tolerance level might be up? So one person who has 2 ounces of hard liquor and compare another person who has 2 ounces of hard liquor, and the impacts might be totally different depending on whether they ate and whether they drink regularly. Your normal reaction time might also impact this. Some people are just naturally slower than others are, and that might impact it. So all of those would be examples of extraneous or confounding. Note that you could have literally millions of potential extraneous or confounding variables. Next thing to look at are the subject groups. And basically what you do is when the subjects come in, they are either in a control group, and this is a group of subjects who's exposed to 0 level of the independent variable. So in the alcohol study, this would be a group who comes in and drinks lemonade and no alcohol whatsoever, and then does their driving simulation. So control group 0 level of the independent variable. And then we have the experimental group or groups, and these groups of subjects are exposed to some level of the independent variable. So in the alcohol example, you could have maybe one group that consumes 2 ounces of hard liquor with lemonade, and the next group consumes 4 ounces, and then one group consumes 6 ounces of hard liquor mixed with lemonade. And those would all three be experimental groups because they're all getting a positive level of alcohol, which was the independent variable. It's really important when you're looking at experiments to make sure that the researcher has used random assignment. So subjects need to be randomly assigned to the control and experimental groups. If subjects are randomly assigned, we can assume that the subjects are actually evenly dispersed, and that the groups, the control group and the experimental groups, are close together from the beginning. So in the alcohol, if you used random assignment and you randomly assigned subjects and you had 100 subjects and you randomly assigned them to the groups, we could assume, because we used random assignment, that tolerance levels for group A and group B are similar. Not for each individual within the group, but the overall tolerance level. We could assume that whether they've eaten or not eaten is similar in all the groups. So basically, this is how we control for those confounding or extraneous variables, is through random assignment. Some of the advantages, well, the major advantage of experimentation is it allows us to establish cause and effect. And again, it is the only one that allows us to establish cause and effect. The disadvantages of experimentation are that is not in a natural environment. So if subjects are coming into the laboratory and drinking alcohol by themselves, sitting in a room, and then waiting 20 minutes and then doing a driving simulation, that might not accurately depict what would happen if a subject was out with their friends at a bar and consumed the same amount of alcohol and then got in their own car. So it's not natural. Another thing is there are certain things that we can't really study in the laboratory. Can't really study, for example, impacts of child abuse in the laboratory because you're certainly not going to bring a child in and abuse them and then see what happens to their behavior afterwards. So there are some disadvantages to the experimentation, but the major advantage is that it allows you to establish cause and effect. Now let's go back to that original study that I talked about and whoa, sorry, there was lightning, I mean thunder outside right now. Um, so here's the original study. Dr. V. Hill is testing the hypothesis that watching violent television causes aggressive behavior. What would the dependent variable be in that particular situation? So look at your options below and tell me what you think the dependent variable would be. And go ahead and write down your answer. We'll go through all of these and then I'll give you the answer to all of them. And if you want, just pause right now so that you have time to look at this. So the first question is the dependent. The next question would be the independent. Third would be what's a possible extraneous or confounding variable. Fourth would be what's the the control group, sorry. And finally, what's the experimental group? And again, if you haven't finished answering that, go ahead and pause, write your answers down, and then start playing again to check your answers because I'll give the answers now. So the dependent variable would be the number of aggressive behaviors observed. The reason for that is in the hypothesis, the researcher believes that the number of aggressive behaviors depends on what kind of television the children were exposed to. Second, the independent, that would be the violent television show, or the Untouchables. Oops, I have a typo on there, sorry. It should be television show. The Untouchables. A possible extraneous variable would be the gender and the age of the subject. This researcher used 8 to 12-year-olds. Maybe 12-year-olds are more aggressive in general than 8-year-olds. Also, it may be that males are more aggressive or females are more aggressive. So those would be possible confounding variables. And what we would do is use random assignment to ensure that those variables are controlled for. Next, the control group. This would be the group that watched the track meet. They're watching video, but they're watching a non-violent video. And finally, the experimental group would be the group of subjects that watched the Untouchables. So they were actually exposed to the independent variable violent television. There could be several experimental groups. We could have a low and a medium and a high level of violence. We could also compare animated violence with non-animated violence, so on, so on, so forth. So I hope this helps and gives you a good basis and understanding of experimentation.